Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's coffee talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, the president of QuickRate, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks again on this Friday morning for joining us for, I was going to say, like our 15th or so installment of the
Yeah.
Coffee Talk, plus or minus, but who's counting? My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the director of analytics here at QuickRate and QwickAnalytics. I spent my entire career working with community banks all over the country in all manners of strategic planning, valuation, M&A, advisory, capital planning, model design. And I've been working with Sean and QuickRate here for over a decade now.
Great. Thank you, Steve. As always, a couple of reminders. You can communicate with us through the chat or the Q&A box. We'll certainly monitor those through the presentation today. And also, we will send out a link to today's recording, as well as a copy of the slide deck. So as we usually do, it'll likely be Monday afternoon or Tuesday that we'll get that out to you with a link and a copy of the slide. So thank you for attending today. Just a reminder of kind of what we're doing here in the coffee talks. Again, just kind of a way to continue to share and provide the opportunity for questions, but also now kind of as we're into the actual execution of CECL, just kind of share with you what we're hearing from other banks, what we're hearing from auditors, from regulators, again, all trying to just continue to make this transition as seamless as possible. So we will start with a few polling questions today as we've done. Let me go ahead and get these launched. And so again, we appreciate you participating in these. Recently, a lot of the questions have been around Q factors and unfunded commitments. So we've got a few of those today, but the first one is, what data do you use, if any, to assist with your external Q factor adjustments? So we're just trying to get a better sense of what everyone's doing. As we've talked in the past, one of the familiar things that kind of came with us from the ALLL was the Q factors. And so, I know many of you already have a process in place, but we do have some banks who are looking to learn more or improve their process. So we thought it'd be worthwhile to have a few polling questions around this today. So we'll just give this a few more seconds and then share the information. All right, so we'll go ahead and end this one. And we'll share the results. So it looks like other economic data and trends, most popular internal analysis conducted by the bank and unemployment data, followed by interest rate trends and peer loss trends. So thank you for participating in that question. Just a few more here. Again, kind of along the lines of Q factors, what sources, again, if any, do you use to assist with your Q factor adjustments? And so here we're just looking for more concrete, sources, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the FRED data, other third-party sources, the data we have available to you in QwickAnalytics. Again, trying to get a better sense of where everyone's sourcing information for this. Just give us another 5 or 10 seconds. Share those results. So it looks like the FRED data, other third-party sources, QwickAnalytics, and then the BLS as well. So again, thank you for participating on that question. Next up, just a question around reserve calculations and the unfunded commitments. How are you calculating your reserve for unfunded commitments? One, you're not calculating it because the lines, in your opinion, are unconditionally cancelable. Two, not calculating because these loans do not exist yet. Three, handling internally, applying essentially some basis point threshold. Or four, using the CECLSolver methodology. This says, again, I think this is an area that we'll discuss, and we have discussed. There's really been no provincial prescription from auditors or regulators around this. We really have seen banks handle in one of three ways. So again, this just seems to be increasingly a question we are receiving. So we wanted to dig in a little deeper here today. So go ahead and end this one. So most of you are using our tool and the methodology that we have. Equally, as many are just applying some type of basis point threshold. And then, there's a percentage you aren't calculating because they're made the determination your lines are unconditionally cancelable. So
It's good to see that not too many responses for the
yeah,
second response there, because while intuitively that seems to make sense to us, that is not the direction that the regulations have been going.
correct. And then the final question is, what feedback, if any, have you received from your regulators regarding the calculation of your reserve for unfunded commitments? And so again, I think it's always, context matters, right? These are the least material pieces of any of the analysis we're doing, really, along with the HTMs. But because it's new, it's part of the guidance. Naturally, it does prompt some questions, particularly here in these early years, where there's not really been a defined approach from regulators or auditors. So, again, we're just trying to dig in here a little bit and continue to knowledge share, with you what we're learning and what we're hearing. So let me go ahead and end this one. And let's share the results. So most of them are 41% are generally comfortable with it. 26% had some questions. 29% did not comment, which isn't terribly surprising. And then 3% suggested an approach for you to use. So that's great. We appreciate everyone participating and contributing to those today. And for many of you, we just had a comment in the chat, right? Many of you may not have been examined yet, right? And I think that really, again, is probably important to note. So typically, and it's important to recognize, some of you may never be, examined around your CECL process, right? I mean, you're going to find validation and, kind of interest highest in the first year of adoption, which makes sense, which is why many of you are experiencing questions from auditors and regulators, because it's these are often most found in the first year. Some of you may find it on the next exam cycle. Some of you may have just gotten, hey, we're glad you got it in place. We may look next year, but again, it's kind of, and I think important to recognize, every auditor and regulator is different. So what they focus on isn't going to be across the board. Different regional offices may have different focuses and priorities in an exam. So, we're trying to, again, share what we hear. Some of you will get, questioned around it or examined around it or have auditor questions, but other views may not. So, again, thanks, Kyle, for the comment. An experienced further review on our portfolio for unfunded due to concentration in construction lending, right? So those types of things, again, concentrations are certainly an area or a catalyst that can spur further conversations. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out there. Before we get started, too, we just wanted to thank all of you who stopped by and saw us at the ICBA convention. It was a nice gathering of banks, and we were really fortunate to see a lot of you stop by the booth, certainly talk about the coffee talks and QwickAnalytics. So again, just wanted to say on behalf of all of us here at QuickRate, a big thank you for working with us, for one, but two, then for stopping by and speaking with us at ICBA Live. So, all right, let's keep moving. Again, just this is really kind of just a reminder, as we've done in a number of these, is continued to share just updates that we have. We'll just touch on a few of those. Obviously, last month we talked about the user management and access control that we recently introduced. Steve, do you want to go ahead and share any thoughts or comments here?
Yeah, this has been received pretty well from the banks that kind of wanted to have a little bit more control, or at least a clearer picture of exactly who internally at the bank has access to the CECLSolver tool. And we offered, or we added an additional user type, read only access, whether that's someone at the bank who you'd like to have access to look at the tool and kind of follow through it, but not be able to modify any inputs or critical assumptions. And that also obviously goes very much so for auditors or other accounting firms or validating firms or examiners who might want to look over it. Now you have full control over adding external third-party users that have only read-only access, and you have a nice little easy console that you can see all the users that have access and what type of access that they have as an administrator of the tool. So this kind of checks the box for a lot of those controls that as a user of a tool like this, you're going to want to have a good clear picture of.
All right, so here's an example, Steve. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, so how you'd
screenshot.
actually do it when you're logged into the CECLSolver. Well, if you go to your name up there on the top right, you can click on user management. If you're just a regular user and not an administrative user, then you'll just be able to see your information on there. But if you are an administrative user for your institution, click on the next slide, Sean. You'll get this sort of summary of all the users, see who are admins, see what kind of access they have, be able to suspend access, change access, or remove access temporarily or completely. And you can also export or PDF this user list. So if you have if you're doing any of those audits or exams where they want to see that you have control over this, you can easily prove that.
Great. A couple of questions in chats just to kind of follow up. So we had a comment come in that their recent state exam indicated a third-party validation of the product will be required. Again, as we've talked about in the past, not suggesting that you won't be. I'm just saying it is a little bit arbitrary, right? So models certainly can be validated, but it's just as a practical example. I've been a director at a community bank for 16 years. Our interest rate risk model, the examiners have asked us to validate it once in 16 years, right? So it's just one of those things. Model validation kind of comes and goes. In this first year of implementation, you would expect it to be requested the most. Again, 2 passive validation. One, what we provide is the SOC 1, and then what you have to do potentially what the bank has to do independently. So I see a comment saying that a SOC 1 won't suffice, right? Again, there's 2 passive validation. There's what we have to do as a solution vendor. That's what the SOC 1 does. You still have validation responsibilities on your end, right? Which you can either perform independently or you have to hire a third party to do for you. So again, we always have confusion on this, right? There's 2 lanes of validation. There's one, what we do. That is not completely take care of everything. It is what the solution provider is able to provide. We can't validate our own work. We have someone do a SOC 1 for our specific portion of the validation effort. The bank is then still responsible for independently validating the tool. Again, you can do that outside of having someone at the bank, outside of the CECL function, perform that validation, or you have to hire a third party. So I just continue to want to try to make that point. There's 2 specific things to do. We cannot do everything as it relates to validation.
Yeah, and the SOC 1 that we can provide focuses on whether our tool is doing proper math, right? And that it meets industry standards. But the other part is how you are interacting with the tool. Everything from what assumptions you're making and whether they're appropriate to who has access to the tool and all that. And those are things that, as Sean mentioned, cannot be provided by us, even if we wanted to help with that. It has to be someone independent of the tool, us, and independent of the function of being responsible for your ACL calculation, whether that's your CFO or whoever that is, but someone who's knowledgeable, right? Whether that's internal or another third-party validator. But most of it kind of focuses on the part that we can't do, focuses on how you're interacting with and utilizing the tool.
Right, and that's what, again, if you want to go back to a previous coffee talk when we had Paul Allen on, we kind of discussed this at great length. Paul's firm, Salt March, is certainly a firm that you can utilize for third-party validations. But again, just remember there's 2 specific paths that have to be kind of completed. And again, we can only complete one of those.
We're adding some more reference guides to our resources on the website. There'll be kind of snippets of video clips where we discuss these individual topics. Some of them come from our coffee talk, some of them come from other presentations that we've done. And so if you have a question or you'd like to hear a kind of a longer, more in-depth discussion of the validation process with an auditor, shoot us an email and we can send you a link to that video. And in the next couple of weeks here, we're kind of redesigning and improving our resource function on the tool, so you'll be able to reach it there as well. But we have a couple, 5 or 6 minute long video clips where we discuss at length with an auditing firm that process and our role and your role in it.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, Mustafa. Question about when our SOC 1 will be updated. So we are in the process of an update now. The firm Bar Advisory, who does our review, indicated they should have it wrapped up by the end of June. So hopefully, we would have a new refreshed, right? This will be the 3rd time we've done it in late June, early July. So that's
we're in the
timetable
right now.
Timetable we're working on right now. Question came in: when I click on user management, all I see is my user login info. We do have 1 or 2 other users. Can I be changed to administrator so I can give access? I would think so. Yes, I would reach out to Jennifer or the customer service.
Yeah, you can email them or right on the tool. There's a little green chat button on the bottom right. You can click on that and immediately discuss it with one of our customer support people, and they can switch on that access for you.
Question on: is there a place to get a guide for how to complete the internal model validation? I don't know specifically a reference for it. I mean, I think we can go to, the FDIC's and OCC guidance and try to find something, around there. I know the OCC has, quite a bit of verbiage around expectations and roles and responsibilities for
it can be difficult to follow because it's kind of general, and not very specific about the individual things that they're going to want. And there's going to be, as we've seen, we have lots of examiners and regulators have not felt the need to validate it, have it further validated, and some have. So their requests for exactly what areas they'd like to see more detail on are going to also, unfortunately, run the gamut.
Yeah, and that's what we, again, when we went to determine what we needed to do for our purposes for the SOC, we went to the OCC's guidance on model validation and, discuss that with our auditing firm and, determine that the most appropriate thing was our SOC 1. We didn't focus as much on the expectations for the bank just because we were focused on what our responsibilities were to provide to you as a solution provider. But again, I think as Steve mentioned, the videos we did with Paul, certainly you can reach out to, Paul Allen at Saltmarsh. You can, if you want his contact information, we're happy to share that as well, as we did in the last coffee talk. Along those lines, right? So what we did, right? An extra step that we took to try to assist institutions who did want to try to perform their portion of the model validation internally, we built this, or I shouldn't say, Steve built this Excel tool to assist you, right? So again, important to recognize, has to be performed by someone outside of the CECL function, but the idea was for at least the component of confirming our math again, this is a parallel tool one could utilize. Steve, go ahead and
well, this, if you hire a third party to go do more validation, they may be asking you a lot of detailed questions about the historical math, even though our SOC does address it. And so the only way to properly do that is to pretty much have access to every single data point that goes into the entire tool and every part of the calculation to do a full, complete, comprehensive review of it. And so this Excel tool does exactly that. It's designed to perfectly mirror your historical analysis tab, which is the guts of all the historical data that go into the first half of CECL. What is our historical lifetime loss rate by pool? And so this allows you to type in the same scenario information, meaning the same warms and the same lookbacks as you have on the interactive tool. And in Excel, it does all the exact same calculations. You can go to other tabs that show all the raw data points and every intermediary calculation from point A to point Z. And then the final lifetime loss rate calculations will match exactly what you have on the interactive tool. It's one of those pull, not push type things, right? If this is not required, this is not needed for you to use our tool to update it on a regular basis for your CECL calculations. This is when someone, specifically and explicitly says, hey, we need to do more. We need to verify some of these calculations, and we can't do it with the assumptions that are visible on the interactive tool. Then you can use the Excel add-in tool. You can use it by yourself. It is automated. Or if you're having issues with that, or you're not really comfortable with the Excel add-in tool because you don't use it very often, it's quite all right. I use it every day. I'm happy to pull it up and help you copy over your scenario, the yellow stuff there, and then you'll see exactly kind of how it follows through all the steps in the middle. And it's not something that you'll need to be refreshing every single quarter unless you're asked to be asking by your auditors to revalidate it, every quarter, which is not reasonable. So it's once a lifetime or once every couple year type thing, hopefully.
Yeah, and again, this was a direct byproduct or result of institutions who were in the midst of having their independent validation being done by a third party, who would send in questions to us and say, hey, we need to demonstrate to our auditor how the historical loss rate was calculated for this particular loan pool with this particular warm, right?
Yep.
And so,
and this look back
and this look back period.
Yeah.
And so again, as Steve touched on, right, they wanted to see every single data point. We have the export from Excel, but this goes the extra step of actually showing the math as well.
Yeah, the first thing we did was provide just a data dump of all the call report data points that go into this, and we were hoping that might suffice. But a lot of the third party firms and examiners we've worked with and whatnot kind of they want us to do the work for them. They don't want to say, all right, thanks for all the data. Now show us exactly how you would use this data to get from A to Z. And so this was kind of the next evolution of that. As far as where you can get access to this tool, on the CECLSolver tool, you click on CECLSolver resources, one of the big blue buttons up top. And on the bottom of that list is the historical loss data and calculation tool. That's what it's called, historical loss data and calculation tool. If you click on it, you'll get a page that explains, hey, you need the Excel add-in to utilize this. If you have it, great. If you don't, here's how you download it. And if you need help with getting this done kind of the first time, you can always reach out to us and we'll help you out.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is our attempt, another attempt, right, just to try to stay out in front of the request and assist in the way we can, with validation, right? Because, again, what we can do is our SOC 1. What you have to do is, again, either perform these extra steps independently or hire a firm to do it for you. So, we're just trying to be as responsive and helpful as we can be, given what we can and can't provide with that. So next up are just, again, some questions. We're hearing from auditor examiners through you, right? So needless yesterday was a big day where Steve and I felt like all we did was, answer questions, right? That, get a lot of requests from, these types of audits and validations that you're going through. So we're kind of, repeatedly and just daily, kind of interacting with those. So we thought, hey, let's, like, the flavor of this week was definitely around unfunded commitments, the Q factors. And so we thought we'd talk about
look back periods
that that banks are using. So before we do this, I do want to remind everyone, and it's kind of on the theme of the auditor and regulators, right? Every auditor and regulator is not the same, right? So they have different levels of understanding of CECL. They have different focuses when they walk into your institution.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to suggest in any way that all of you are going to be asked these same questions by your auditor or regulator, but I do want to share what we are hearing because it's possible you could be asked.
And that's the trick with it is that we could give boilerplate type responses and pepper our site with those, but they're all when it comes down to it, they're all unique questions or situations, right? If you ask, well, what am I going to need? My answer is two other questions. Well, who's asking, and what side of the bed did they get up on? So so it's
Right.
really there's no generic. We can put a generic PDF response out there, but it's going to be a waste of space because it's not really going to satisfy the explicit questions that you get when the rubber meets the road.
Correct. And I
Um,
think, yeah, and that's really what we're trying to address, right? Is Steve said, right? There's no silver bullet here to address every issue that a bank might receive. So we're trying to, as best we can, obviously address them all individually, but two, share what we feel like is the overriding theme of topics that again you might encounter. Hopefully you won't, but you might. And as Steve said, right, every auditor or regulator is different when they walk in your door, and that's just something obviously we can't completely account for.
and while I have a captive audience here, as Sean mentioned, we got a lot of questions yesterday. So if you happen to be on the call and you're waiting for
Yeah.
an answer from your question yesterday, just know if I didn't get to it, it's because I was getting ready for this today. But
And we're working on them.
you're on the list, and we'll get back to you right away.
Yeah, this afternoon once we get finished with
Yeah.
the call talk. But yes, you're right, absolutely right. Yesterday was quite a day. All right, so one of the questions that comes up, and again, right, it's unfunded commitments are new to the process. As we mentioned, there's really been no provincial prescription on how to handle these. When we designed the tool, we didn't feel like it would be sufficient to provide no, kind of path for you to work with these. We anticipated that, some banks would dismiss these because they had the ability to unconditionally cancel them. We know some banks would look at these and say, hey, these aren't loans yet. I'm not going to reserve for it. We knew some banks would just apply a basis points. But then again, we felt like we had to have something more than that when we designed our tool. So this was the approach that we took. Now, naturally, again, for most banks, this is not a material reserve or a number, but for candidly, for a lot of auditors and regulators, they're curious about what people are doing. So as they looked at ours, again, we're getting more questions on how kind of, where are these numbers coming from? How did you get to these numbers? And so we initially tried to address a lot of those in footnotes, but we, are experiencing through questions from auditors, and particularly auditors, not really regulators, but auditors, they want more detail on how everything's calculated. So we thought we're taking steps to try to make this more transparent, more immediately able to be discussed by you in the tool. But we thought today, if nothing else, we'd begin a discussion around this. So Steve, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, our footnotes were getting more and more voluminous. They were starting to look more like an epic saga than anything else. And so I think we figured, just kind of some repetition and some summary discussion of the steps that we take in the way we decided to help out with the unfunded commitments would be warranted. So the portion that I've highlighted in green, I'll kind of briefly summarize the steps up to that part, and then we'll talk about that for a minute. We do in the footnotes, it does explain sort of when we're estimating or giving you kind of a starting point at least for your annual expected loss rates on the unfunded commitments. When the math is a little bit more challenging there for how we got to our kind of default starting point, we have some footnotes explaining why, but this kind of makes a direct link to, hey, these are the segments on the funded portfolio that we thought might be appropriate to or match most closely to these segments here. Some of the confusion is because in their infinite wisdom, the FDIC decided to use different buckets for unused commitments than they have for the rest of the actual funded loan portfolio. Why they did this, I'm not exactly sure. Most of them are one-to-one. Obviously, C&I comes from C&I, 1 to 4 family revolving and credit card loans. It's pretty straightforward. But CRE, other construction and land and development loans, are one unfunded commitment bucket, despite being 4 or 5 buckets on Schedule RCC, on your actual loan segmentation. Same thing with the all other, right? That catch-all bucket here is very different from the catch-all bucket on Schedule RCC. Not efficient or intuitive, but it is what it is. So in looking at the unfunded commitments, kind of taking a step back, we can get your total unfunded commitments from the call reports, right? That's something that you do have to fill out each quarter. But one little piece of grace that the accountants gave us was that any of your unfunded commitments that you could deem to be unconditionally cancelable, things like credit card loans are the only, really one of the only completely universal examples. There are maybe there are some others as well, but the credit card loans are kind of a definition of unconditionally cancelable and usually overdrafts. But I digress. So you can back out any that are unconditionally cancelable. That information is not on the call report by segment. The total unconditionally cancelable unfunded commitments is a line item kind of dug deep in the call report, but by segment it's not. So we ask you guys to look at those commitments and determine whether they are and plug that in for us. We can back that out. We don't need to worry about unconditionally cancelable commitments ever from a reserve standpoint. Then we have to, obviously they're unfunded right now. They're commitments, but we don't know how much are going to actually fund. And so we ask you to give us an estimate of the probability of funding. This is where another spot where we were looking for some sort of guidance so we could give you a starting point for estimating this. And where we get that from is what the regulators call CCFs, or credit conversion factors. That was kind of, after doing some studies, they sort of determined from a regulatory capital standpoint for these unused lines, what percentage of them might fund within a reasonable period of time, like say a year. And so we take those, they're either 20 basis or 20% or 50%, depending upon the unfunded commitment. And so we can kind of get a weighted average between that 20 and 50 by looking at how many unused commitments you had that had a shorter original maturity versus a longer one from your call report data. Sometimes if you fill that out. And so if we don't have that data, we just kind of take the average of 20 and 50 and say, hey, 35% is a good starting point. But that's not based on any very much of your data. A lot of this stuff on the unfunded commitments, there's a limited amount of data that we can get publicly available from the call reports. So this is a spot where you'll really want to think about each of these assumptions and each of these default starting points that we've given you and understand why we chose those starting points, but think carefully about how your commitments, your specific commitments might not match that and make your own subjective decisions as to what direction to go in. But really the point today is for the annual expected loss rates, because we're thinking about on the rest of the portfolio, we're thinking about lifetime loss rates, right? We're not thinking about it in 1 year chunks. But on the unfunded commitments, because some of the guidance around estimated probability of fundings and whatnot were kind of annual probability of fundings, we had to sort of back it out to think about years and then multiply it to get back to a lifetime expected loss rate. So these annual expected loss rates come from the expected loss rates that you have on your funded portfolio, right? And the mapping is right there in that green column. So for example, for 1 to 4 family revolving loans, that's item C. So if you go to the next screen for a second, we're going to toggle back and forth here. You'll see I went ahead and just took a snapshot of your loan portfolio page, of the summary loan portfolio page, and put the letters there on the side. So letter C is 1 to 4 family revolving, right? There is a 79 basis point. If you can see there, the expected future loss rate, lifetime loss rate is 79 basis points over 5 years, the warmest 5 years. So what is that on an annual basis? 79 divided by 5. So that would be what? About
16 rounded up.
16. There you go. So if you toggle back to the last screen, you'll see that is 16. The column F is 16. Why is the expected lifetime loss rate not that high? Well, because we have estimated, because it's not 100%, there's only a certain probability of funding over a certain weighted average remaining commitment or maturity. So there's some additional math there, but all the parts of that math, you'll notice up on the header there, D times E times F equals G. That's the expected lifetime loss rate. That times C, which is the net on the balance, equals a reserve that you might set aside. But again, those annual expected loss rates are estimates based upon a close approximation of your funded portfolio and not knowing what the individual commitments are and not having the buckets match perfectly. So there's some ambiguity here for sure, which is why we wanted to make sure that you were clear on our starting point was for you so that you can justify where you ultimately conclude the process. And I put some more highlighted in green there, a kind of an explanation of what I've just discussed today. So this, I'll make sure it gets onto our resources page, these two, just so you can see that mapping. And I'll probably put the Excel file instead of a PDF, so you can click on that cell and actually see the Excel formula coming from the summary tab. We're using sample data, obviously, but hopefully that helps clear that up. Again, I know we've circled this many times, right, and shot at it from different angles, but we thought a more explicit discussion could be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Again, I think this, again, coming out of the conversations we've had with a number of you that we've had with auditors and regulators, right? I think one of the real values that we've tried to build into CECLSolver for all of you is to make this as transparent as possible. Because again, going back to the validation expectations, right? One of the expectations of you by the standard is that you understand and can explain your tool to your board, to third parties. And so, our belief when we created this and designed it was to try to make everything as transparent as we could. We probably didn't do that as strongly in the unfunded commitments just because it wasn't quite as material, and we didn't really expect some of this interest in it, but nonetheless, here we are. So we're taking
their
steps
understanding,
to do it.
the powers that be, their understanding of direction they were expecting to see was extremely ambiguous at the time, and
correct.
still is not as much so. They're
right
solidifying
when we went to the FDIC and we were designing the tool and showed them what we did with unfunded commitments, they said, "Hey, this is great." So we didn't.
You're doing something. You're giving them an option. I'm like, and we're like, "How do you like this option?" They're like, "Yeah, it's an option."
So we felt like we had done enough, but now once we've got in with the auditors, they certainly have wanted more transparency. So so again, you're trying to meet expectations as best you can. As we've talked about oftentimes before, everything's evolving, and so we're just trying to continue to evolve to make this as helpful and seamless for you as we can. Another issue we've gotten here recently, is the ability, for a lot of you who've had the great fortune of having really benign credit experience over the recent years. We have had in the last month a number of institutions who have, whether it was an auditor or a regulator, suggested to the bank that they, because of the benign loss experience, that they look at a longer economic period, but still utilize the current WARM, but look at a longer historical period of time. This is exactly what the customizable look back period does for you. Again, it's optional, but again, some of you might be asked by an auditor or regulator to at least evaluate another scenario where you incorporate a longer look back. Not saying you're going to, but just you might. And so again, there's functionality here to help you address that should you be asked that question. So Steve, go ahead and talk through this one again.
This is an actual bank that someone on the call someone might recognize on the call, Sean. And but I plugged in some round numbers for the warrants. But this is not an uncommon situation at all, where these are the actual losses. You notice anything other than zeros in the highlighted area? I don't. The lifetime loss rates historically are 0 for every single segment of this loan portfolio, using some WARMs that are not super short, right? Still have a 5-year WARM on the mortgages, a 4-year WARM on the junior liens, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll notice that 100%, if these are your WARMs and this is your historical look back periods, the entire burden of your reserve falls on your Q factors. That's not new news for many of you on the call. I mean, many of you have been dealing with that reality in the old methodology, in the old ALLL, right? So this is not necessarily new conceptually even. However, we have examiners or auditors to come in and say, hey, why don't you just lengthen the look back period? And while we can certainly defend the method or have a justification for why we chose to match warms, the lookbacks with warms, it's certainly a subjective decision. And so you might say, well, let's just pick an arbitrarily long look back period, let's say across the board. We'll use, I don't know, 10 or 11 or 12 years so that we get all the way back to and including some of the last credit cycle, right? That'll at least, maybe that'll get us, that'll end up with a lifetime loss rates that aren't zero, that incorporate some of the last credit cycle and have some more stress, so to speak, built into them. So we don't have so much burden on Q factors. So if you click on the next slide, Sean, the quick and easy way to do that, to modify your look back periods across the board, to just make them arbitrarily longer or shorter, you can do it by segment. You can just click on the segment itself and change the beginning or end of a look back. Or if you want to do them all in one foul swoop, I took a screenshot here. You go to the historical analysis page, click on the set common date range blue button, and then you can just choose, let's say 1Q 2012, 2012. So what that will do is it'll take, for every segment, you're going back 12 years. And if you click on the next slide, you'll see what that would look like. You'll end up with these blue bars, right, which represent the look back period, right? The period over which we're gathering data is going all the way back to 2012. And you'll see that there are some non-zero values in there, right? We're capturing what, owner-occupied, non-farm, non-residentials that had some significant losses back during the last credit cycle, caught some losses at the end of the last credit cycle in the mortgage portfolio when they're in 2012, 59 basis points, and C&I as well. And so your warms haven't changed, right? But your look back periods have. So you have to do a little bit of additional math, which is captured there in the in that lifetime look back multiplier. But what it ends up doing is capturing more of your loss history. Maybe we'll get some lifetime historical losses in there. And what that would mean is you'd be shifting the burden of your loss rate a little bit away from Q factors and towards the historical ones, which means if you do this, you probably should be modifying your Q factors down some. Because if you think about it, if I'm using the last 4 years as history and I had no losses, right? And my expected future loss rate has to be all from how I think things are going to be worse in the future than they have been over the last 5 years. If now you're going back and looking at part of the last credit cycle in your history, your Q factors, how things are going to be different in the future, is less, should be less, right? Because you're already taking into account some bad times that aren't recent, but did happen a long time ago. So I just want to realize that we're not making things better or worse. We're shifting the blame a little bit, so to speak, within that context.
Yeah. And I think, just let me jump in here for a second, Steve. Right. Again, I think for some of us, this might be advantageous because we'd prefer to rely less on our Q factors, which is more subjective, and rely more on something objectively like our longer loss experience, right? Again, as we've said before in this, right, reserve analysis is art and science, right? That there's beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Everybody approaches their reserve in a different way. Auditors and regulators approach reserves in a different way. This is just another way for you to consider. Again, not suggesting this is what you need to do.
No, there's many times totally inappropriate. If your portfolio has changed in its composition or your risk characteristics or your entire loan department, kind of swapped out in 2016, you might have you probably do have a very good argument to say anything that happened in 2013 is completely irrelevant to my expectations of losses going forward over the next few years. So why would I use that? And the answer is that you shouldn't. But if you've had a pretty consistent loan portfolio, you haven't seen a whole lot of growth, you've had the same team in place for the whole cycle, then going back further is more justifiable. So just another tool to help with that. And you might not go back 12 years. You might say, hey, I'm going to match my look backs to my warms, except for my segments that I have a really short warm, right? If I've got, from my construction portfolio, if I've got a half a year warm, I can understand my auditor saying, hey, I know it's only a half a year long duration, but can you get a couple years worth of historical stuff in there so we can at least take that into account? You can just set a minimum. And for any of my warms that are under 2 years, I'm going to make the look back period at least 2 years. And you can just extend those ones individually by clicking on those drop down boxes on the right there. and tweaking it for that segment. That actually is probably a very good balanced approach, honestly, in
Yeah.
many situations.
And I think, to that end, right, we're still using your current warm, right? But we're expanding that look back period.
Yeah.
Celeste, thank you for your comment. She's actually kind of incorporating this into her analysis today. Another question or chat came in. What's an appropriate minimum for the look back period? Right. Again,
That's just it.
yeah, there's no
If you
standard.
find out, please give us a call, because we've heard everybody is aware that picking a number out of a hat is arbitrary. 5 years, 7 years, 12 years. Our what we were trying to accomplish by matching the look back to the warms was making it, in our opinion, less arbitrary, right? Because the concept of CECL is you're trying to estimate losses over a lifetime, not over a specific period of time like a year. Whatever that lifetime is, we thought, well, for loans that you have long lifetimes, you probably want to go back further in time to see how they perform over a lifetime. For ones with a shorter duration, so I need to go back 13 iterations of that portfolio, 13 turnovers to get an idea of how it performs? Probably not. So that makes sense to us methodologically, but it's probably, I would say it's much more common, although less justifiable in my opinion. It's easier just to pick, say, 7 years or 10 years.
Yeah. And again, let's not miss the point of the warm, right? The whole idea of the warm, and why Steve said we took a symmetrical approach, is in the pursuit of those lifetime losses. The warm methodology set up as the suggestion. All right, let's look over the remaining maturity. What's the likely necessary reserve for that remaining maturity? Again, the most practical way for most of us to think about that and address that is to look back an equivalent period of time, what that warm represents, and see what net charge-offs looked like in that period of time. And so again, that's the kind of the symmetrical nature of the warm and CECLSolver. But what it doesn't perfectly account for is warm periods that we've had more recently where that is zero. And so then that's where you want to have a little bit of flexibility and optionality. So you don't necessarily have to rely completely on your Q factors. It's obviously fine to do it that way, but you might get, best practices suggested to you to look at additional look back periods is kind of what we're ultimately saying. This just could be a best practice.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. We did have let's see.
Well, there's a follow-up. There's another one. There's one little more piece of this discussion
Okay.
that on the next slide.
Okay. Let me move that.
Yeah, just another. Yeah, and another. Let's say instead of arbitrarily choosing 12 years, right? Let's say you might look at your loss history and say, listen, if I expand these historical loss rate, these look-back periods by another couple of years, I'm just going to get 2 more years of zeros. So how is that even really helping me, right? If my loss rate, if my net charge-offs over the last 3 years were 0, 0, 0 on the whole portfolio, and the 3 years before that were also 0, 0, 0 or very close to it, extending the lookbacks is going to have zero impact on your historical lifetime loss rate. However, it will have an impact on comparable peer data, right? You might find that your losses are still negligible if you extend the look back, but your peer data may capture more. So this is an example of a peer group where the last couple of years were like 6-7 basis points in median net losses in the whole portfolio over the last couple of years. But in 2020, 2019, they were more like 15 to 20 basis points. So if you extended that look back period, it didn't seem to make any difference on your historical loss rate. But if you're using the peer data as one of your qualitative factor adjustments, right, looking at how much more losses your peers had than you over this period, and then using that to justify a Q factor adjustment, having a longer look back will give you some more justification, some more defense, some more ammunition for why you chose this, a larger Q factor adjustment from your 0, historical to your whatever it is, expected future. So just another way to think about it.
Yeah, and again, I think this is again kind of feeds into the one of the reasons we introduced peer factor or peer data into the analysis, right? It obviously doesn't impact the calculation, but it does give you some context. It does potentially support an additional Q factor that's objectively based, that you can utilize, right? So again, just
the
trying
peer
to
data
give
is not perfect, but it is the peer data is not is never perfect, right? But it is completely objective, and it is matched to the exact same buckets, right? Because we're using call, one of the strengths of our using and sticking as much as we can to the call report buckets is that the peer data we're looking at is perfectly apples to apples to your historical data. As soon as you're using a bunch of internally designated buckets that are not call report buckets, you lose the ability to compare it objectively apples to apples to anything external, right? Because it's not public. Um, so it gives you some more hard evidence to justify what you may have a lot of soft Q factor adjustments. This is a more quantitative one to kind of help balance that out.
Yeah, and let's remember too, right? I mean, all of us are fortunate that charge-offs in our banks are really rare, right? They're usually, in some ways, almost one-offs and explainable, right? And so for a lot of us, right, really defending our reserve value or level, whatever it is, right, is really what we're ultimately after, right? Because we have been fortunate and our charge-off rates are very, very low. And so, I think what these potentially offer you is a way to, again, move some of that, as Steve said, burden, if you will, to support or defend your reserve with Q factors, which tend to be more subjective. This just may give you the opportunity to move something that's more objective, that you can have as the basis for that. So again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But I just want to kind of let you better understand what we're thinking and trying to do in response to questions that we get, and just kind of more almost as much philosophical questions as actual nuts and bolts. So thank you for the chats, the kind words in there too. So thank you all for putting those in here. We'll move on. Next up is, why don't you, this came up in a
These are in
review
quotes,
done.
by the way. All these
Yes,
topics
in
are in quotes
quotes.
because these are exact, explicit questions we've gotten in the last 2 weeks from actual auditors, specifically to our users about things that they think you should that you should be considering. So why don't your warms, the balances that you use when you're calculating your warms, right, perfectly match up to your current balances in the CECLSolver summary? So we've gotten this question a few times, and we've tried to address it, but this is another attempt to do so. Your warm calculations, if you look at the methodologies and you look at the code from from FASB, they need to be relatively current. They need to be accurate and current. They do not necessarily need to be as calculated as of the exact same as of date for your reserve calculation, right? If you're doing a reserve calculation on May 1st as of the end of the first quarter, and you're plugging in or you're plugging in your loan balances as of the date that you want the calculation, your warms, just you need to make sure that your warms are still accurate. So warm values tend not to have very much variability quarter to quarter. If you think about it, it's an average of all your maturity dates within a bucket. If you've got hundreds and hundreds of loans in a bucket, and you have a regular pattern of loans maturing, falling off the end, right, and new loans being originated, unless you have a significant, a huge uptick in growth in new loans or some sort of very abnormal maturity schedule, you're going to see kind of a normal distribution of maturities throughout your portfolio, which means that over time, your warms are not going to change very much. So expecting and warms can be calculated, kind of skipping around here a little bit. They can be accurately calculated using just a representative sample of loans from that segment, very much the way you would do an external loan review. When you do an external loan review, it is meant to calculate the risk you have in the whole portfolio, but you're just examining a fragment of a loans in that portfolio and extrapolating similar characteristics, right? Same thing can be said with warm. The warm data is loan level data, right? Whenever you're dealing with loan level data, it's going to be a bit messy, right? You're going to have some holes here or there. You'll have some negative maturity dates that just weren't updated because of a renewal or something else. You'll have some balances that are negative because of some odd, situation going on. Whatever that is, you don't need to spend a huge amount of time working on all of your internal loan docs to make sure there is not one loan in your portfolio that can't be perfectly put into a WARM calculation. It's just an average over that entire segment. If I were to take out any 5 or 10 or 15 loans from any reasonably sized segment of your portfolio, your WARM will not be changed by more than 6 basis points out, right? It just doesn't happen. Now, if 20% of your loans in your portfolio have have no maturity date, that's a problem. That's something you're going to have to work with to get an accurate WARM calculation. But the moral of the story here is there is no tying back of the exact to the decimal point balance of the loans you use in your WARM calculation, which is just an input into the CECLSolver tool, versus the current loan balance you're using on your final reserve calculation for that point in time. Anyone trying to match those two numbers doesn't have a full picture of how they should be used. They're just trying to, match A to B without the right understanding behind it. So we'd be happy to help you explain that to, if there's any auditors or examiners who are a stickler for that and they think that they've got you by having something be off by a small amount. They don't marry and match up in the way that they think that they might. Sean, is there a better way for me to kind of bounce it around the concept a little bit here?
No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, I would say, right, and whether we're doing it or you're doing it internally for your WARMs, because right, about 50% of you have us calculate your WARMs, 50% of you, you're doing it on your own. But it is a good exercise to monitor, like in our file, we send back the problem loan tab, just to, as Steve mentioned, update and use it as a quality control device to make sure, because it will spot problems in your, like, again, whether it's a bad maturity date, negative amortization, something, whatever it did to essentially not have us capture it in our calculation. You can see it in the problem loan tab, what in fact it was. 90% of them are usually loans that are in some type of renewal and the maturity dates, passed.
Yeah.
Lapsed,
And so
right?
that problem loan tab is not for you to do anything with other than monitor it. If it gets too long, if you add up the balances on the problem loan tab and it's like 20% of your portfolio, you need to do something, but you've probably got a bigger fish to fry than the ACL calculation from a loan quality, data quality standpoint. But it's just something, you keep an eye on it. If an examiner asks why these things don't match up, you say, well, there's these handful of loans we keep an eye on. They've got some bad data in it. They are immaterial. That's the term we're looking for here is materiality. They are not in 99% of cases. Those balances, those loans are immaterial to the WARM calculation and therefore have no impact whatsoever on your reserve calculation. It's not like we're missing a reserve for any of those loans that are on the problem loan calculation tab. That is not the case at all. We're just not using that information, that maturity date in our WARM calculation. Since our ACL calculation, the final reserve calculation, uses your total current balances, right, from your GL or your call report, we're not missing these loans at all in the reserve, just in the WARM average. That's it. Big difference.
Big difference. And so materiality is always important. But again, just as a, loan administration, just kind of quality control, just be mindful of that. We did have a comment come in about submitting call report. We do not have up-to-date quarter information. Obviously, does it compromise the calculations by us overriding the totals column of each segment? No, I mean, again, as Steve pointed out, right, the loss rate that you have, the appropriate loan total balance, right, like that's ultimately what's driving the reserve. So
I mean, using a better example, instead of thinking about, well, I'm doing this as of 3/31, but I don't have 3/31 historical data yet from my peers and from everything else because no one's filed yet, right? Think about it, same concept, think about it a little bit differently. Let's say this was June 1st and you were doing a monthly ACL calculation, right? You would still only have March 31st historical data for your call report and for your peers, but you're calculating something as of June 1st. So you plug in your current balances as of June 1st. All it means is the historical calculations that you were doing in the first part of your reserve analysis used a different historical. They still used the appropriate WARMs. They were still appropriate calculations. They were just using a different historical period. They didn't include the last couple months. And that is still completely okay. There's always going to be somewhat of a lag between your historical data set and your as of date of many calculations, not just reserve related. This is a very common occurrence in accounting. And anything that makes up that gap, if your losses over the last couple months since your last call report or since your last filed call report are generally within the same kind of trends as they were before, you don't need to do anything. You're still good. If you saw a huge bump in losses or something changed materially between your last historical call report data and the date of your report, that's a Q factor adjustment. You still don't need to worry about modifying history and overriding a bunch of manual stuff, because the definition of a Q factor is all the reasons why current and future conditions are different from your long-term historical trends, right? So anything happened in the last month, that is a current condition that's different from your long-term historical trends. So the only thing you need to make sure that you are doing, if you have a gap between, your as of date is a little different than your historical, and there's a gap there. The as of date, your current balances on the summary tab, on this loan portfolio summary, should always be as of the exact date that you're doing the ACL calculation, whether you use call report data or your own internal GL.
So we did have a question, or comment come in. A bank state examiner expected them to do pre-call report and post-call report filing calculation. Again, this is kind of where I say not every examiner and regulator is the same. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer if your examiner asks you to do that, right? Ultimately, you have to do that. But I would argue you'll probably find that there's really not much difference. Materiality is always here, but I would not expect that to be
it ends up becoming kind of
a standard
inter quarterly true up, which if that true up isn't material after a quarter or two, maybe that examiner at that point drops that additional requirement, if they even ask in the first place. Who knows?
Yeah. Another question or comment came in about future forecasts, in our Q factors. For the external things, again, I think here, right? So let's talk about what a Q factor is, right? It's really, as Steve touched on earlier, but ultimately it's designed to capture and account for any risk not resident or found in your current loss numbers, right?
Yep.
So as Steve has said earlier,
in your historical
historicals. So almost by definition, you are doing a future forecast because you're accounting for anything that's not already based in your history. So how it's going to be different in the future.
Yeah, and you can't ignore Q factors. No adjustment doesn't mean that you're still making an assumption. If your Q factor adjustment is 0, that is the same. You're still saying something actively. You're saying that in the future we expect these conditions to be the same or similar to they were during this historical period that we used as the first, in the historical loss rate calculation. So we can't get away with, well, I'm going to ignore Q factors by not putting any. Not putting any means 0, and 0 is an actual number, just like a negative or a positive number is a number. So it's still subjectively making a statement about your expectations.
Correct. And so again, this is truly, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Everybody has their own process, right? And I think that's what we've always emphasized. You've had a process that your bank, your board, your regulators, your auditors have all seemingly been comfortable with. Nothing really has changed with that. That process still should be intact because, Q factors were always kind of capturing, how you viewed the future. Are we looking a little bit longer now? And I think, Kyle put in a comment of how he's handling it in the chats for everybody to see. But that process is really, not really changed. And so, I think it's always interesting when an examiner or an auditor is now questioning something that they've accepted for a number of years as now not quite being, right? So again, it's a little bit of it's always going to be a little bit of subjectivity. I think we have to try to address those individual requests we get from an auditor examiner. Forecasting is a really difficult thing, as we've said before, right? If you think about forecasting interest rates, right? I mean, most of us, we spend a lot of time forecasting interest rates. It can be an almost, I don't want to say a fool's errand, but we can spend a lot of time and energy on it and not have it to do it. I'm not sure if we looked at all of our Q factors today and we really made a huge distinction about doing something different than we're doing today, we'd get a much different result than the Q factors we're putting into place today, right? We are essentially, between our historical loss rates and our Q factors, we are making a determination, a forecast of what we think an appropriate level of reserves are needed to address any net charge-off activity in our loan portfolio, right? Like if we want to, like we're going to drill down and again try to be overly precise. I'm not sure it makes us any more accurate. So it's a challenging thing. It's why I think we, like we have the matrix. We want to try to, give as much understanding to our auditors and examiners of why we make changes. But me personally, the forecasting, is a big rabbit hole, right? Like you can spend a lot of time and energy. If you really want something, go to the Fred site. All of the Fed economists, they put it together, a summary of economic projections. Right? That's the Fed. They've got more resources than all of us at looking at the economy. Like if that's not enough for an auditor or an examiner, I mean, what else would they expect us to do, right? Like these are people who are focused specifically on trying to project the economy. They're not 100% right about it. I'm just not sure what they expect an individual bank to do more beyond that. So I'm not sure that's a great answer, Celeste. I'm sorry, but that's, again, I think, you can go to the Fed site and get the summary of economic projections and reference that, every quarter because they have it out there on their site. Another question came in on how banks are handling surplus reserve balances. Our ACL for unfunded commitments is very volatile. We do not reverse surplus balances at this point. Yeah, again, I think, hopefully we can, if you want to, you can reach out to us. We can talk about to see why there's such volatility there. But we can talk to you about maybe how to potentially smooth some of that out based on maybe some of the assumptions that you're making. Steve, anything you want to add to that one?
Nope. I think there's different ways, certainly different ways. That doesn't speak to how the tool works. Is more from a practical standpoint. As we get bounces up and down, do they expect us to continually have positive and negative provisions for the unfunded commitments? On the income statement each quarter as unfunded commitments become funded and the new ones become, because you're never going to have a loss on an unfunded commitment, right? So you have this separate reserve now on the liability side of the balance sheet for your unfunded commitments. And you see it just bouncing up and down every quarter as those unfunded commitment current balances go up and down. And you have to account for that on the income statement with these weird, positive and negative provisions for ACL for unfunded, even though nothing is really happening from a loss perspective. And that's a byproduct of the way they've designed CECL. So if from a practical standpoint, they're cool with you just kind of keeping it flat and allowing some of these quarterly fluctuations to happen, then that's great. I think it's I think the next the response to that from one of our other people on the call today makes sense, that there's, looking at some sort of materiality threshold, right? Whether if it's going up by 25%, we probably need to add a little, provision in there to true it up some, or even if we expect it to come back down the next quarter. But if it's within a certain plus minus kind of threshold, then we think it's reasonable as long as they agree with it. That's kind of, they got the keys to the kingdom when it comes to those assumptions and whether they think that they're appropriate or not.
Okay, I know we're up over the hour. Just a reminder, we have tried to continue to put up past webinars on our YouTube channel, so certainly reference the link there at the bottom of the page.
I see that one of the comments from Kyle. If you want to talk a little bit more about the specifically about the projection period and whatnot compared to the Q factors, give us a buzz, and I have some other thoughts on that. We're happy to discuss it further. But I think that what you mentioned there in the comment makes sense for what is one certainly way to manage or handle it.
Just a reminder for those of you who do want to dig deeper into your portfolio, we do have a 6-month free trial on our IntelliCredit Portfolio Analyzer. Again, I think one of the advantages we see for this is it will help you spot trends or have better information about your portfolio. I think in many ways this might be the the future of Q factors, having more type of this data available to you so that you can make determinations on whether risk is rising or changing in your portfolio, and rely less on more abstract things like economic projections. I think having more tangible information about our loan portfolios is really what should drive our Q factors. But because most of us don't have that available to us, we can't rely on it. I think the analyzer is one of the tools that we believe can help you with that. So certainly, we want to encourage you to take us up on our trial so you can make that determination for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. So you can certainly reach out to us at info@intellicredit.com and take advantage of our trial. We do have some upcoming events coming up. May 3rd, we will have another loan data coffee talk where, again, we talk about the analyzer and just some of the again, value that we see banks who are currently using it do, but also just kind of talk about some current credit trends. And then we will also be doing a webinar, on QwickAnalytics on May 8th. So obviously with CECL, most of you obviously are using that, but with QwickAnalytics, you have a much broader use of tools that you may or may not as be familiar with or as comfortable with or understand what they can help you with. So we're going to, in a webinar on the 8th, Steve and I'll just talk about some specific bank challenges where we know QwickAnalytics has assisted or helped, some of our banks address those.
Yeah, and even if you can't make that webinar, go ahead and register for it so we can send you the copy of the presentation afterwards. We're certainly not just a CECL shop, so to speak. There's a lot of really good stuff on there. If you haven't really spent some time to investigate all the other spots and nooks and crannies of QwickAnalytics, this will be a great way to see specific things that we know a lot of our bankers are improving their processes by using different parts of the tool that are not CECL.
Perfect. Exactly. Yeah, we think there's a lot of wonderful tools in there, and we want to, just like we've done in these coffee talks, try to continue to educate you on how to best use these and get the most out of these solutions.
Yeah, I'd really like to talk to you guys about something other than CECL for a change at some point, if that's okay with everybody.
So our next coffee talk will be at the end of April 26th. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you on that one. Steve, any final thoughts before we let everybody get to their weekend?
I think we've talked enough for one day.
All right. Well, this was great today. I appreciate all the comments. If any of this, again, these topics are a little bit tough because they are, there's a lot of subjectivity and kind of randomness that comes in depending on the auditor examiner you encounter. So if you're unsatisfied or didn't necessarily feel like we answered your question fully, reach out to us. We'll jump on a Zoom, talk through them in greater detail. Because again, our goal with these is to make sure this is as smooth a transition and continues to be as possible. So again, a lot of times when we have one-off issues, they may take more time than just what we can allot in the coffee talk. So reach out to us, info@quickrate.com. Reach out to your salesperson. We can get a call with Steve or myself and talk through any of those in greater detail. So again, on behalf of Steve and all of us, thanks so much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.